Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. I'm Tom Keene, along with Paul Sweeney. Join us each day for insight from the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app. Joining us now for a 3-hour conversation, Tina Fordham with Fordham Global Insights. Last time she's on, it's a blur, folks. She was like absolutely outstanding. Tina, I don't even know where to begin this morning. But let's begin, and I had the honor of talking to Ethan Bronner this morning, and I know David Gura, folks, is working on a big take. Tina Fordham on the state of Israel. I go back to the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin to look at a new, more angry Israel. How angry is Israel this morning with these two assassination murders, deaths?
The assassinations of the Hamas official, the political leader of Hamas in Tehran, where he was attending the inauguration of the new Iranian president, was a very bold step and signal for Israel to take. And then, was it yesterday, or it's just, as you said, a blur, another assassination in Beirut? Does Israel want to expand the war, or, as some have suggested, is Netanyahu taking, these bold steps so that he can claim victory and end the war? I'm not an optimist on this, though, Tom.
All right, Tina, so that kind of brings you to, I think, one of the questions today, certainly from a lot of viewers, is I thought we were maybe on a path to some type of peace negotiations, and then out of the blue, it seems, these two high-profile assassinations. Where do you think the Israeli government is, the Israeli people are, in terms of next steps?
I think we've got to look at this and the Venezuela developments and Ukraine, for that matter, in the context of our elections coming up in November. Last week, Netanyahu had, 4 standing ovations in his address to Congress. He visited Trump in Mar-a-Lago. The Harris juggernaut is continuing. Could it be that Netanyahu feels that he's got a window, a very narrow window, to accomplish some goals and take out more of the Hamas leadership? Or does he want to drag the United States into war? I'm more inclined to the former, the idea of having a narrow window to accomplish some big strategic objectives.
All right, so Tina, let's go down to Venezuela here. Can you put into context what's happening down there, and what do you think will eventually kind of fall out from all of this?
So after many efforts in the past, it had looked like the opposition in Venezuela was ready to take power in an election. They were polling with a huge lead, something like plus 30 points. Such a margin that it would be difficult, they thought, to have these election results falsified. What's happened? Maduro, who's been in power for 13 years since the death of Hugo Chavez, who was popularly elected for his part, has falsified the results. Either that, or he's just taking a long time to count them, because it's been 3 days. About a dozen protesters have been killed, huge crowds in the streets. And the Organization of American States has said that Maduro's response bears all the hallmarks of a falsified election. So it's not too, it's not too late for a democratic transition, but it might get worse before it gets better.
Let's stay on this. I just don't want to jump. There's so much news flow, Tina. My head is spinning here on a almost into August summer morning. On Venezuela, Tina, do you detect an Latin American foreign policy? Does Washington have a LATAM policy?
Well, we haven't heard from the Biden administration, and I return you to that idea of a narrow window. And I think I said on the last program, one of my Fordham geopolitical razors, that governments can only concentrate on one thing at a time. I think eventually we'll hear something from the State Department and the Biden administration. But so far, we've heard from Lula in Brazil, being cautious, from Boric in Chile, but Russia and Iran and the United States are also linked on this one. The last thing the Kremlin wants, or Tehran wants to see, is a successful, popular, democratic transition.
So, Tina, as Tom was mentioning, there's a million ways to go here, and I apologize for jumping all around, but while we have you, what's the latest coming out of Ukraine? It seems like a little bit of momentum going back to Russia. Any updated thoughts to how this plays out?
Yeah, this is the danger zone summer. I think yesterday Russia launched its sort of biggest drone attack on Ukraine for some months. It's also the height of the summer fighting season. And I'm arguing that the period between now and November, and maybe until Inauguration Day in January of next year, is going to see an uptick in geopolitical risk. And that matters for your listeners, because they're all watching the Fed. Conflicts are inflationary, and this is the time to go for it.
Hugely valuable. Tina Fordham, thank you so much. Fordham Global Advisors, really can't say enough. Fordham Global Insight. Emily Roland saying, why am I here? She's with John Hancock. And a major victory lap for Hancock, who have said, quality, big, stay with it. So I see the hysteria over Microsoft yesterday. I'm looking at the 4 accounting statements. I don't have every answer, but geez, it looked pretty good. It's up 16%, right?
Absolutely. And the guidance was really strong, too, heading into 2025. And you look at earnings for tech companies this quarter, they're tracking to be up about 18% year over year. I'll take it. Meanwhile, you look at this massive rotation into small cap stocks, those earnings are down 18%. So I don't get it.
Paul's got 8 questions because he's got to triple his NVIDIA holding. But let me get one more in here. Emily, what I see is we're trying to figure out our new discounted cash flow. And the answer is with Microsoft, nobody's looking out 7 years.
Right.
What are they doing now? And as Nadella nailed yesterday, what are we doing next year? And maybe what we're doing 26 is the perspective.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's the show me the money kind of period right now for tech companies. And again, the earnings are there. Yes, it's a multi-year process to fully monetize the investment that many of these companies are making in AI, but we're going to get there. A lot was in the price. The valuations were extended. It doesn't surprise me that there's a little bit of profit taking in tech right now, but we remain overweight, and we think it's a healthy little mini correction here. Again, as there was a lot in the price, it's an over-owned part of the market, and we'll be okay.
What do you make of this, I guess, what is really a rotation into some of these small cap sectors, just maybe some sectors that were maybe underloved here? What do you make of this rotation play?
Well, it's been really interesting. Small caps, as measured by the S&P 600, are now up about 10% on the month, while the S&P 500 is flat. And if you look under the hood, it's all been driven from multiple expansion. The entire 10% is PE expansion. And so I have like a little checklist for small caps. What are some of the things that could be kind of supporting them? And I think about inflation. Well, we've seen 2 consecutive months of low inflation readings, so that doesn't make sense. Maybe some changes in earnings trends. We just talked about that. That's not happening. Maybe a shift in the macro backdrop. Nope, we're still in a late cycle environment. Maybe the bond market still pricing in 2 cuts. So nothing's really changed except maybe one thing, which is the odds of a Trump presidency have increased over the course of the month. So I think there's a sentiment-driven rally that's politically driven around potential outcomes regarding the election that's causing sentiment to soar. We would fade it.
Well, as Tom was just mentioning, the news flow is so heavy, we're barely touching on the fact that we've got a Fed meeting today, and we're going to hear from Fed Chairman Jay Powell. again, you mentioned the market's pricing in a couple of cuts this year. Is that enough for this market, or how do you view the Fed, and what do you want to hear today?
Yeah, it's whether or not Powell's going to commit, or whether he's going to keep playing the field, if you will. So is he going to commit to the September cut, or is he going to wait until there's even more evidence?
So like the Red Sox at the trading deadline.
I knew you were going to go to the Red Sox. It's so
the Fed.
Yeah, so it's real. That's what it's about right now. It's like, is Powell going to tell us with more certainty that he's confident that inflation's decelerating? There are more cracks in the labor market. September's a done deal. We think it should be. You know, the Fed funds rate's at 5.5%, core PCE's at 2.6%. You're seeing, again, more and more evidence that deflation is presenting itself.
Right.
But, you know, how hawkish or dovish is that message going to come across?
The backdrop of this, and Paul and I have been waiting for this, Sweeney's nailed this, is the 2 years coming in to 4 decimal points, the nominal 10 years breaking down 4.1297. I'm going to sell that as a 412 handle. And the real yield elegantly comes in now a 187 handle. What does that yield breakdown in fixed income mean for the stock market?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, markets are still reacting in fairly positive way to lower bond yields. So there's still a kind of bad news for the economy is good news for market scenario. And where markets are still kind of sunning themselves on soft landing island right now. You know, you talk about vacation time. That's what it feels like, because we have this kind of slowdown in the economy that's not super slow, and there's nothing sinister that looks like is happening right now. So the Fed can do this kind of like, I kind of think of it as like a nice guy cut starting in September, just because they can. Now, if you think that the Fed, we can have this soft landing, that's fine, but you're kind of betting against the odds in a way, because there's really only ever been one example of these kind of preemptive cuts, which was in the mid-1990s. So we want to think about any backup in bond yields as an opportunity to lean in and lock in this elevated yield, because we don't think bonds are priced for an economic contraction. So there's a nice opportunity there to get paid income while you wait.
Yeah, absolutely. So how much... I mean, again, on the 2-year Treasury, 4.35%, do I sit there and be quite comfortable, or do I take some credit risk here?
Yeah, we're underweight credit within fixed income just because there's really no risk being priced in. High yield bond spreads are at 306 basis points this morning. That is well below the 20-year average of 500 basis points. So there's not much being priced in. We looked at some data. When we've been at spreads this tight, the forward-looking returns are about flat on a 12-month basis. There's just not a lot to say about the return opportunity based on the fundamentals there.
Why did the Red Sox not pick up Jazz Chisholm? I mean, you're wired in it, old and new John Hancock.
So the biggest mistake I made coming in here today, I studied everything from the Fed to the BOJ to the earnings back. I have my number. I forgot to study baseball, and that was the biggest mistake that I made this morning.
You got to. This is the trade deadline's over. It's exciting. And the Yankees have won 4 in a row against Philadelphia.
I know.
Our conversation of the day on this tech frenzy. Anurag Rana joins us from Chicago. Microsoft down 7%, now down 3.4%. I found, Anurag, the hysteria out on Twitter yesterday over a little bit of a miss in Azure. And then I see, I think from Amy Hood, that on Microsoft, 8% of CapEx is AI type. Does the public understand all of their CapEx is not going into artificial intelligence?
See, it may not be directly tied to it, but at the end of the day, they have to increase cloud capacity for those workloads. Even if it's not directly tied, think about it this way. You have to digitize your processes. You have to upgrade to the cloud, because without that, you won't be able to run some of those workloads or analytics on top of it.
So, Anurag, what's the street? Give us a sense of what the street's really thinking about Microsoft and the cloud and AI and Microsoft's position. Is the street generally confident that Microsoft is in a good position, maybe faces some risks?
Yeah, I think from an analyst community point of view, we have a very good understanding of what's happening at Microsoft. Sometimes what happens is you have momentum investors who get in and they want an NVIDIA-like quarter coming out of Microsoft. Now, that's not going to happen because for Microsoft, it's a long journey. It's not going to be suddenly somebody's going to buy so many chips and your revenue gets a boost. They have to build capacity. Then people are going to build workloads on it. And that's exactly what Microsoft explained yesterday, that they will increase their CapEx. And the second half of their fiscal year, you will see an improvement in the cloud growth rate. And I think that pacified a lot of investors. Stock was down 7, 8, 9%, but it's only down 2.5%, 3% at this point.
What else are you looking for when you see a Microsoft number cross the tape, aside from kind of this AI angle?
I think so far the biggest contribution for AI has been coming from OpenAI relationship and the workloads that are going on it. We really want to see how AI gets infused in other products across the Microsoft portfolio. We already know, a product like GitHub Copilot or Office Copilot, but we really need to see stronger adoption numbers from there, because down the road, that's going to be the key bread and butter for Microsoft, and perhaps not so much directly coming from OpenAI.
Can we go to Meta? I mean, I guess Meta's not really on your watch, Anurag, but lump it in here with the knowledge you want to receive from Meta this afternoon.
I think it's going to be a combination of capital expenditures and what they are doing for their AI and large language models, as well as their ad revenue. I think you can extend this discussion to not just Meta, but also on Amazon on Thursday, because even they will come out and say they are increasing the capital expenditures. But I think everybody really needs to recognize this thing. The CapEx expansion is happening now, and the revenue will follow. And there is going to be a lag and mismatch between the two, you could say, capital outlays.
So that kind of goes to the issue. I mean, part of the weakness that we've seen in Magnificent Seven over the past, month or so, Anurag, has been that question you just raised about, okay, we get all the spending for AI, but what's the ROI on that? How do you answer that question from investors?
I think a lot of, long-term value investors would understand that you have to build the capacity to recognize that revenue growth. In addition to what you said about CapEx, I think there is another factor that people are looking at, a possible interest rate cut and what the impact of that would have on the small cap universe. We recently did a study where we saw the gap between the large cap valuation of technology and software companies is so much wider than the small caps. And the problem with the small caps is because of the economic slowdown, they have not seen that big AI bump that the big guys have.
Anurag Rana, thank you so much for joining us. The news flow today, just incredible. Right now, we're going to get a brief from the best in Washington. Nancy Cook joins us to say she's our District of Columbia reporter, doesn't give her due credit for following the election grind. Nancy, when you saw the Bloomberg-Morning Consult poll, there's 40 other polls coming out. What's different about this poll than the others now and in the future?
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think what is different and new is that this is one of the first polls that we have seen from swing states since Vice President Kamala Harris became the presumptive Democratic nominee. And it's just really crucial because it shows that she has really closed the gap with former President Donald Trump in these swing states. It shows us that she is getting a lot of enthusiasm from suburban women, young people, Black people. Go ahead.
Well, the criticism of the poll was it when you go out and you poll people, you get who you get. And typically polls, I believe, are more Democrats than Republicans, and then they adjust for that. Do you have confidence in the polls? And I mean, not only the Bloomberg Morning Consult poll, but the whole racket of 45, 60 polls that we have in America.
Well, I think polls have been really tricky. And, you raise a great point. I mean, they were certainly, have been wrong in the past. I think that what you can look at is that, the New York Times and Siena College also did a poll last week showing, Vice President Harris gaining ground on Trump. And so while I wouldn't put stock in any individual poll, I think that, that you can draw some trend lines based on the totality of what you were seeing. I think that we saw former President Donald Trump be super dominant the first half of this year. And I think that what we're seeing now, based on our poll, but also other polls that have come out recently, is that Harris is going to give him, I think, much more of a run for his money than Biden did.
Is is there any ability to get a sense of whether this is just kind of the honeymoon period, euphoria driving these numbers, or whether there's something deeper there?
Well, I think that we won't know that until after the Democratic National Convention, which is in a few weeks. There's certainly a honeymoon period. I think Democrats are wildly enthusiastic about her candidacy, but, she hasn't been under a ton of scrutiny yet. She hasn't picked a running mate. She has started to do some campaign events, but she's not on the campaign trail day in and day out or being asked questions. So I feel like, how that plays in September is really an open question.
So what is, I guess, who is really supporting this strength in Harris? Do we have demographics that really stand out to you?
Sure. So a bunch of the demographics that have stood out to me from our poll is that she is picking up a lot of support with young voters who were very turned off by, Biden's handling of what was happening in Israel and Gaza. She is turning out, or a lot of people who are suburban women are expressing enthusiasm for her. The Trump people have had a very hard time winning those folks over. And then the Trump team was really hoping to make inroads with young Black men in particular. And what we're seeing is Black voters are very enthused by her candidacy. And so those are all ways in which she could sort of rebuild the Democratic coalition.
I saw, Nancy, that she amended something to do with oil production. I can't remember in the last couple of days because she's got to win Wisconsin or, oil in Pennsylvania. The details don't matter. But what matters here is, does a pro like you suggest she will be a Venn diagram with Biden policy, not of 100%, but will she be like 80% Biden policy? Can you quantify that?
So that's a great question, Tom. I think it's still really early to tell. What I have been told from her advisors is that she's not, for instance, going to come out with like a whole new economic agenda or a whole new economic policy. So in that sense, it's going to be like, sort of keeping and talking about a lot of the Biden policies. But I think she is going to emphasize different things.
Hey, Nancy, is there a feeling in D.C. about what role, if any, President Biden will play in VP Harris's campaign?
I think he's playing very little role. I mean, he's at the White House, he's still president, obviously serving out his time. And I think he and his people are intensely focused on his legacy and getting through the next 6 months. But I don't think he's going to play a huge role.
Any early feel as to, I guess, the next big move for the Harris ticket is the vice president role here. Is there any feeling as to when and who it might be?
So we had published a story on Saturday that said that her short list had really been pared down to, a few people: Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, and Governor Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania. I think those are the people that her team is most focused on. And I think that we'll have a pick by Tuesday of next week. She's going to do a big swing through a bunch of the battleground states like Pennsylvania and Nevada, and she's going to have her running mate with her. So it's going to come, in the next few days.
All right. Nancy, we got to do some economic data. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy Cook, for her leadership and our coverage of this election. It gets more interesting by the day. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, bringing you the best in economics, finance, investment, and international relations. You can also watch the show live on YouTube. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to see the show weekday mornings from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern from our global headquarters in New York City. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen, and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.